RETECH, a podcast for teachers seeking fresh viewpoints, deeper subject knowledge, and diverse thinking.
Hi everybody, and welcome to this final episode of Series 2 of the History RETECH podcast. Fear not, however, we will be back in the autumn term, that's Autumn UK, for Series 3. And we love your feedback. We're delighted that we've got a global audience, and we hope that we're helping to start conversations, inform and shape curriculums as well. Now, as I've said, this is the last episode of this series, and we're ending really on a really sort of serious and important topic. In the United Kingdom, in March 2024, the Historical Association commissioned simultaneous editions of their teaching history and primary history periodicals, focusing solely on climate and environment. The current crisis is human-induced, and so far the humanities curriculum is playing catch-up, whereas individual teachers have been trialling materials, and University College London even have a CPD, Teaching for Sustainable Futures programme, which is online and freely available. Now, today I'm absolutely thrilled because I'm joined by someone who has long been an advocate for history to play its role in understanding the present predicament and considering how we might respond. Kate Hawkey is a senior lecturer at the University of Bristol. She's been involved in history teacher education for many years, amazingly since the 1990s, and was until recently responsible for the secondary history PGCE programme at the university. Now, very modestly, she tells me that she works very part-time, supervising a few students doing research for their doctorates, when in reality, she has written a pioneering book which was published last year that's also freely available, open access, where she makes a compelling case for the inclusion of the environment in the history curriculum. Welcome to the RETECH podcast, Kate.
Thank you. That's a brilliant introduction. Thank you so much for that.
You're very welcome, and thank you for writing this incredible book, which I've been reading recently, and it set my mind spinning in all kinds of directions. So let's fill the listeners in. The full title of your book is History and the Climate Crisis, Environmental History in the Classroom. Now, it might be even that listeners are a bit puzzled as to what environmental history is, but there's clearly a sense of urgency generated here in the title, even though it might seem as though there are other more obvious places for the environment to be dealt with. So why should history teachers address the roots of the current crisis?
That's, everything that we do in history, I think, is aimed at trying to understand the present moment. So there's clearly a strong relationship between the past and the present. What we choose to prioritise and focus on and what we choose to ignore always reflects something about the present. And there's a good example from Bristol, where I live. You will know that in 2020, Edward Colston's statue was thrown into the docks. And earlier in that same year, Greta Thunberg visited Bristol to join one of the youth climate strikes. And it seems to me that these two events both have a historical hinterland which warrants exploring in classrooms. You will know that the toppling of Colston and the broader Black Lives Matter protests have spurred on the development of decolonising initiatives in the curriculum. And in the same way, I suggest that the climate crisis needs to spur us on to teach history, which includes environmental perspectives. And today, many would argue that decolonising and what some people are calling decarbonising the curriculum are really two sides of the same coin. You can't decolonise a curriculum without a consideration of humanity's relationship with the environment. We've always had ongoing revisions in the history curriculum. SHP back in the 1970s is such a good example of that. And I think what I'm suggesting is really just part of that same process of an ongoing revision to keep the subject relevant to today's concerns. If we take a really long view and look at the origins of the discipline, it takes us back to the 18th century and the Enlightenment, when there was a focus on nation building, and the likes of von Ranke worked hard to professionalise the role of historians, and with a great emphasis on evidence and documentary sources. And actually we can recognise a lot of that in the history that we still teach today. But the world has changed and it continues to change, and the curriculum needs to as well. The climate crisis and the associated biodiversity loss are so important that we all need to put environmental concerns at the centre of what we do. And hence, that's why I include environment in the title of the book. But I don't mean that we need to add another scholarly specialism to the crowded curriculum, but rather it needs to be embedded in what we teach in schools. And here's a bold claim, which some may not like. Subjects like science and geography clearly have important inputs to make about the climate crisis. But the crisis is also to do with attitudes, beliefs, values, and culture. And that's the stuff of history, really. And I argue that we need to better understand these roots of the crisis in order that we can forge a different future to the one that current trajectories suggest we're heading for. So coming back to addressing the historical roots, I think doing that also leads to a critique of current academic and professional practice, which I argue in the book can result in strengthening the disciplinary history that we offer to students in schools. In other words, it can help them to improve their understanding of history and the nature of the discipline. And there's a chapter in the book that looks at how taking an environmental perspective impacts on our understanding of the second-order concepts that underpin history.
So many history teachers might feel that this isn't their domain. They might feel rather nervous about this. I know Peter Langdon has contributed to the Teaching History magazine and also a chapter in What is History Teaching Now, which are two great starting points as well. I think he quotes an Oxfam study in that from 2019, whereby 75% of history teachers felt a bit out of their depth when it came to the environment. But the structure of your book, I think, is really helpful because it takes a macro and a micro approach. And when I was reading it, I was realizing how things could be slotted into what I already would be teaching. I also saw what opportunities I've maybe missed in the past. So it's not too onerous, in my opinion. So I just wonder how you imagine your book might be used to help history teaching teams.
Yes. So the book is deliberately a hybrid, which, I wasn't sure publishers would be interested in that, but it struck me as being really important that it was a hybrid. So it starts with a strong academic voice making the case for change. And that's important because we need to be clear that we're on solid ground whenever we make changes to the curriculum. But then the book moves step by step, I hope, into more practical concerns, which I imagine teachers will be particularly interested in. So one of the key aims in the book, I suppose, responding to the work of Peter Langdon and the number of teachers who don't feel confident in this area. So one of the aims is to build substantive subject knowledge. So, for example, there's a chapter which looks at how humans have thought about the rest of nature over very large sweeps of time. We don't tend to teach this in schools currently, but I think it's a key aspect if we're really going to understand the crisis we're in today. But I know that this sort of bigger history at large scale, can sometimes be difficult and quite dry for children. So I supplement this with human scale examples which illustrate these bigger themes. So, for example, there's a bit about the English diggers and their attempts to live more sustainably with the rest of nature. And then I talk about Henry Ford's failed experiment in the Brazilian jungle, Fordlandia, which illustrates how unsustainable practices led to failure. So I can imagine people teaching those two small-scale stories, but in so doing, helping children to understand that great sweep of change and changing attitudes. So that's one approach that the book takes to build knowledge in areas which may be new for teachers. Another approach is to take more familiar topics that we do teach and to look at these with a more environmental lens. So there's something in the book about James Watt, which many schools will be teaching James Watt, I'm sure. And there's something else about the 17th century and the era of the Civil War, again, something which is commonly taught. And then something about NASA images of the Earth in the 1960s. And I know many schools will teach the space race, for example. But in each of these cases, I come at it from an environmental perspective, which results in slightly different learning outcomes. So I hope the book does a lot to support the development of teachers' subject knowledge, which I think is such an important priority. And it also includes resources and stimuli which can be used in classrooms, as well as sketching out some practical strategies. It's not full of lesson plans, but there's stuff for teachers to work with in the book to get them started, I suppose.
Well, I would absolutely agree. Those three examples that you gave, I was thinking, I was off to get £50 notes with Watt and Bolton as compared to Alan Turing. And I thought, how great would that be in a lesson if you rocked up with two £50 notes with the two different individuals talking about, I think it was the 2011 and the 2021, who to include on the £50 notes. And then you think about the later sort of NASA, the blue marble and the black marble. And I actually thought, would 12, 14-year-olds know about marbles? I even thought maybe I'll go and get some marbles, So all kinds of practical hands-on, you talk about the importance of visual resources as well. And your book just had my mind spinning, the diggers and Gerald Winstanley and the 16th century crisis linked to the Little Ice Age, the cards that you've got there. I was thinking of a teacher, a CPD activity, sorting and classifying and thinking about the cards that you have in there as well. So there really are really thoughtful suggestions for teachers. And I tried to you talk about scale and the longue durée. I think you use that phrase, that big history idea. I tried to summarize the book in 10 words. So see what you think here. I went for scale, time, place, nature, humans, utopia. You mentioned Fordlandia. I was thinking about New Harmony and Robert Owen as well as another failed experiment.
Yeah.
Rachel Carson. Zoonotic, which is my new Scrabble word. Statistics, because the statistics in there are shocking. And in my experience, young people are very hooked in by statistics, or they can be. And Earth. There is no planet B. Earth was my final. They're my 10 anyway. Challenge.
Oh, I love it.
I challenge the listeners to maybe, summarize their own 10 and let us know what they come up with. Yeah. So you mentioned obviously that teachers invariably have different starting points, but students will have too. You mentioned Greta Thunberg earlier and, eco-anxiety. There's probably a continuum between activism on the part of some young people and absolute apathy. What's the point? It's all too far gone type of attitude. I mean, what guidance can you provide here about how best to walk that line in classrooms?
Yeah, I think that's so important, isn't it? And actually so important because if we are to persuade teachers to pick up this mantle, they need to be confident in that respect. I think it was Chris Husbands who said something along the lines of knowledge matters, curriculum matters, but pedagogy probably matters most. It's so important. So we always have to start with where students are at, their incoming perceptions. And on this subject, there will be a range, well, as with most subjects actually, but, particularly this one. So there'll be some students and their families who don't believe in climate change, although I suspect that number's in decline. Some who think technology will find solutions, some who are angry at older generations for letting us get into this mess, and some who are terrified with eco-anxiety, and that's probably on the rise, I think. And some who don't give it much thought, not least because they may have more pressing concerns such as poverty and getting food on the table. So it's clearly a difficult area to step into. It's sensitive and controversial, particularly because it impacts on the future of students' lives. So the short answer to your question is that we need to teach it with the same considerations as we do when we teach any other controversial and sensitive subject. And history's got lots of experience of doing that and knowing what works and what's best avoided. So with potentially upsetting topics, we need to think carefully about what we teach to children of different ages, what's appropriate at different ages. We need to avoid shocking graphic images and highly emotive language, and we need to use human stories and so on. And with difficult controversial topics, we need to recognise the complexity of the topic and not to oversimplify. And we need to avoid being disparaging about people in the past. But we do teach difficult topics in history. You know, we teach Palestine, Israel, we teach transatlantic slavery, we teach the Holocaust, and those are all really difficult topics, but we don't shy away from them. Alison Kitson and Alan McCulley some years ago talked about the different stances that can be taken towards teaching controversial subjects, and they characterise it as avoiders, containers and risk takers. And in the history classroom, we should be risk takers. We have established procedures relating to evidence and inquiry so that, in a way, it becomes one of the most appropriate spaces where difficult issues can be explored in a structured and supported way. I'm also aware that some of the initiative to address or do more about the climate crisis has actually come from students themselves. They were the ones who took to the streets on the youth climate strikes, saying to the adults, actually, this needs attention. So I think we need to not shy away from that. In some ways, children are ahead of us on this, and we need to do our part as well.
Absolutely. I mean, you mentioned Alison Kitson there, and she contributes with Michael Riley to the first article in the Teaching History periodical. It's Teaching History 194, March 2024. Paula Worth, David Rawlings, Dan Warner Meanwell, Peter Langdon, Helen Snelson, Adrian Gonzalez, and Nebiat Michael, Amanda Power, Verity Morgan, Nini Vischer, Barbara Trapani, all of these people. I guess some of them are perhaps members of the Bristol Pizza Group.
Indeed.
Where you talk topics and have been doing for some years. But we know the history curriculum is already very crowded. You know, there's another issue that we need to be talking about. And progressive teachers, driven by social justice, are aiming to be inclusive and diverse. You mentioned the idea of being a risk taker. I think the work was done with teachers in Northern Ireland, wasn't it, to categorise them and think about approaches. So how do you think teachers can go about tackling this big history, this longue durée, if you like? I know things like, medicine through time or medicine and the people is a classic example, isn't it? How can teachers go about doing this in a manageable and achievable way?
Yeah, it's such a good point and so important. And I've already mentioned, and in the book I mentioned there are a couple of ways thus far we've talked about. Any initiatives to decolonise the curriculum is an opportunity to focus on environmental aspects. So that's one thing. And I think a lot of schools are doing work in that. And there is an opportunity there to tweak things and to bring some environmental perspectives in. And secondly, existing units can be approached with an environmental lens. And the book does detail some examples. I'd like to just draw attention. You mentioned the work of Verity Morgan. I think that's been really useful. She's doing her doctoral work at the moment. And she's looked at teachers' perceptions of the value of adding environmental perspectives in their teaching. And in the Teaching History 194 that you mentioned, she looks at the Black Death, Empire, and the First World War, which are all such mainstream topics, but she looks at them from an environmental perspective. And importantly, she includes all her resources for teaching these units, so teachers can access them. And some of the findings of her work, actually having ready resources, I think is going to be really important. You know, my own book is open access at UCL, and there's all sorts of interesting work being done by other teachers, and it's all open access. So that I would encourage teachers to look at. You've mentioned UCL's Centre for Climate Change and Sustainability Education, the work of Alison and Michael up in London, and they've got some great resources too. And you've mentioned Peter Langdon. I think Simon Beale is another person who's done some really interesting work which is available. So all of that's important. And then I think teachers can make small changes. So, for example, when we talk about economic causes, we're often referring to environmental causes, you know, the failure of harvests, famines affecting the price of grain and so on. So that's a small win, as appropriate, of course. We can start introducing the term environmental into our discussions. And you mentioned the pizza group here in Bristol, and we've been meeting for 10 years, and each year take a different focus and teachers try things in their classrooms. This year, we've looked at history and the climate crisis. And what we've noticed is that this is much more challenging than in previous years, where we've looked at, you know, more familiar topics like assessment or concepts such as consequence. So this year, some teachers are trying things out in their classrooms, but others are simply talking to their colleagues more and putting it as a sort of standing item on their departmental meetings. So change can be slow. There are some quick wins, but I think it will be gradual, incremental, and we need to take teachers with us, of course, along the way.
You mentioned that the pizza group. We in Carlisle, we used to have a pudding group. The late Jean Worth used to invite us round for puddings, and it wasn't just history teachers, it was teachers from across the curriculum. All the people who loved Jean's creamy pudding, let's be honest, would gather at her house and see where, you know, the links could be made between and across subjects. And I think we're missing such a trick if we don't collaborate in that way and work together and see where we can strengthen and amplify the same messages, perhaps. You mentioned Verity Morgan, you mentioned the Black Death. Now, the Black Death is an absolute staple. It's on everyone's curriculum, isn't it? And I'm been teaching since the early 1990s. Used to think about pandemics and the Black Death as something that happened in the Middle Ages, and then COVID-19 struck, and my whole worldview was altered completely. And chapter 5 of your book argues that the co-evolution of microbes and humans, including epidemics, has been a major force in shaping history. Now, we've recently lived through this, so all teachers currently may find this a way in, something proximal to young people. Maybe of interest to Key Stage 3 with the Black Death, or medicine, health and the people at GCSE. Can you tell us a bit more about the causes, impacts and linked events within chapter 5?
Yes, yeah. I'll start with an anecdote. During COVID, I was watching an episode of University Challenge, and one question was, what's the name given to the process where disease can be passed across species from animals to humans? And the answer is zoonosis. But not one of these very clever 8 participants knew the answer. And that was surprising to me, because there we were in the middle of a global pandemic and, you know, very high death rates in England at that time. And it said something to me about what we do and don't prioritise in the knowledge that we teach. So if we look, you know, at history way back, when we moved from being nomadic into settled agricultural communities, we started living at much closer quarters to animals. And that's when infections jumped across species. Most of our childhood diseases, smallpox, measles, mumps, whooping cough, and so on, were originally animal pathogens which jumped across to humans. And there's been a sort of co-evolution. Of course, lots of microbes are really useful to us. They digest our food and protect us against infections, but some are harmful. But if they are so harmful that they kill us, the host, outright, then the microbe probably dies too. So, which is not helpful to the microbe. So there's been a co-evolution between the two. And we're all descended from ancestors who survived epidemics in the past, handing on some of their resistance to their offspring. Now, we do look at epidemics in history, and of course the Black Death is such a brilliant topic to teach. Taking a more environmental lens to it, there is some evidence to suggest that with the reduced numbers of labourers in the fields, there was an increase in the number of spread of trees, which led to reduced levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, so that temperatures dropped. So there's some evidence that the Black Death itself may have been a contributory factor to the Little Ice Age itself. Wasn't the main cause, no one would go on to claim that, but it may have been one factor in those dropping temperatures. And then, of course, if we look at the expansion into the New World, that brought about a microbial exchange on a devastating scale. The Europeans took smallpox, measles, flu to the Americas and decimated the indigenous populations who had no resistance. And it's estimated that about 90% of the indigenous population was wiped out. So we often focus in history on the military conquest, but that was due mainly to microbes. And there's another interesting link between malaria and transatlantic slavery. Malaria spread from Africa to America, probably on board slave ships in barrels. Europeans and indigenous people in America had no defence against malaria, in contrast to some people in West Africa where they had some level of defence that had been built up over years. So this meant that people from West Africa were particularly valuable in those parts of America where malaria had become endemic. And there is some evidence of, achieving higher prices because of their value and having some defence against malaria. And then, of course, there's Spanish flu, which may have killed more people than First and Second World Wars put together, but we don't tend to teach it much, which is interesting for what it says about our priorities. And how we remember wars and how we remember pandemics is different. And I think that would be an interesting topic to explore in classrooms and could help students themselves to begin to critique the curriculum that we teach. And then, of course, there's the story of Woodrow Wilson, who was struggling with flu when the Versailles Treaty was signed. Now, we don't know if he would have pressed for more lenient terms for Germany had he been well, but nonetheless, it's an interesting element to bring into the discussions of that topic. So I suppose what I'm doing in that chapter is to say microbes are really important as wars, revolutions and economic change. And we don't always put them in the foreground as much as I think we perhaps should.
Well, you're absolutely right. I thought Spanish flu, who knew, When it shocked and surprised me, the information in your book, and you've got a great table looking at the facts and figures as well that runs to a couple of pages. I tweeted a picture of it yesterday because I was so taken by it. And the Woodrow Wilson story, his grandmother, I think it was from Carlisle. There's a Wetherspoons named the Woodrow Wilson, which my students always go to celebrate their results in, and they tell me that they're doing historic research of great importance. So I'll not forevermore be able to make the Spanish flu link, which I didn't realise about in the past. You also demonstrate that environmental history is not a neutral concept, and it intersects with other revisionist themes which you've touched upon: race, gender and power. Can you give us a possible curricular example of this?
Yes, I will. So in the book, I look at two examples, and one is a theme across time, and that one relates to the idea of wilderness and its intersection with ideas around race. And the other one focuses on an individual, and that individual is Rachel Carson. So that one is looking at the sort of intersection between environment and gender. So in the 19th century, as you'll know, there was a sort of upsurge of interest in the idea of wilderness throughout the Western world, partly against the backdrop of rapid change and industrialization, Wordsworth up in the lakes and so on. And in the States, the idea of wilderness was actually essentially a white settler construct where there was an imagined, pristine, unspoilt landscape which had no people in it. And of course, we know that that really wasn't the case at all. The land was peopled by indigenous Americans who were then gradually removed from this pristine landscape and later segregated in cities too. And some of the people who we now associate with the environmental movement at that time, people like Emerson, Thoreau and John Muir, that they tended to regard the indigenous people as noble savages, essentially thinking that they were inferior to the white man and his civilizing mission. So it's interesting to see how race intersects with environment. And I think those tensions have continued. It's whether it's right for an indigenous people to be able to build a casino on land where there are endangered salamanders. Now, you know, that puts environmental issues around people's identities in conflict. Interestingly, the Dakota pipeline, I think there's been some coming together. Sort of climate justice concerns have brought Indigenous peoples and environmentalists together to oppose that. But they don't always sit alongside each other. There are tensions there. And the other example I give in the book is about Rachel Carson and her book Silent Spring, which focused on the dangerous impacts of pesticide use. And it's often cited as launching the environmental movement of the 1960s. And despite its accuracy about the dangers of pesticides, Carson's work came in for attack from the chemicals industry. No surprise there, perhaps. But some of the attacks were extremely personal and disparaging and misogynistic. She was described as a spinster, never having married, and she was dismissed as being a sentimental nature lover. So that's an interesting story about an individual who campaigned on environmental issues, who was criticised and put down for being a woman. And there's an interesting comparison, I think, which can be drawn with Greta Thunberg, who likewise has been disparaged for being both female and indeed a child. You know, Trump saying that she needed to chill and work on her anger management. So yes, it's never neutral, and it does intersect with other themes that we look at in the history curriculum.
I love how Greta came back at Trump and told him to chill and get over it when he lost the election as well, you know? So touche, yeah. I thought that you mentioned that in the book as well, which is great. It's so readable, honestly. It's fabulous, so thought-provoking. I recommend it to everyone. So finally then, Kate, what's next for environmental history? Where do you see it going? You're obviously starting these conversations, spreading the word. Any other radical implications?
Yeah, it is such an exciting time with an increasing number of teachers wanting to and starting to change their practice to include environmental history. It's brilliant. And hopefully my book is a useful starting point. The Teaching History edition is also excellent for getting people started in this area. Lots of possible classroom units. And we've mentioned people who are worth following in this area. Verity Morgan, Peter Langdon, Simon Beale. I'm sure there are many others, and apologies if I haven't mentioned you. And of course, UCL's work. I think it would be really helpful for the exam boards to start developing their GCSE specs to include environmental history. It would make a great theme across time, wouldn't it, that we could look at? And we know that what's included on a GCSE gives status to that history. It also results in textbooks being written, and that also has an impact on what's taught at Key Stage 3, Key Stage 5, and even into primary schools. So there are the beginnings of interest in this area with the exam boards, I think, and I think that's encouraging, and I really hope that develops further. In terms of more radical implications, part of the logic of environmental history is that it's a challenge to human exceptionalism. We are one agent of history, and we're certainly a very, very important one. There's no doubt about that. But there are other agents in history, and I think teachers can do some really interesting work on this in classrooms. So one activity I suggest in the book is to ask students, a teacher could ask students what they think is the most significant event or development in the last 100 years. And I can imagine all sorts of sensible suggestions, the world wars, the atomic bomb, the internet, contraceptive pill. They're all good suggestions. But a teacher could then suggest that the most significant event should be a small mammal on a small Australian island, which in 2019 was declared extinct. And this is significant because it was the first animal to definitely become extinct because of human-caused climate change. And this could lead into a really interesting discussion about biodiversity loss, living in a time of mass extinction, and then thinking about how we should characterise the time we live in, whether we should think about this time as the Anthropocene, and if so, think when did that start? And those are all great discussions that we could be having in history classrooms. I was delighted to see Barbara Trapani's article in Teaching History, which looks at the history of trees and their relationship to humans. It was great to see that in a Teaching History edition. And in my book, I draw from Amitav Ghosh's excellent book, The Nutmeg's Curse. If you haven't read it, then that's a must. It really is. And that's a history of colonialism in the Banda Islands, what used to be called the Spice Islands. I suggest that students could look at the Banda Islands and tell that history from the perspective of the nutmeg tree. And I'm inspired by the work of Michael Riley, where he used the Akan drum as a way of telling a story of transatlantic slavery. So we do this already in history. And all of this will help students to develop and improve their grasp of disciplinary history. Because in a way, what we're doing, we're asking questions like, who tells the story? Who gets to be heard? And whose voice is ignored? And that, at the end of the day, is at the heart of what good history education looks like.
Here, Kate. Fantastic. Honestly, I've thoroughly enjoyed our conversation. And you talk about human exceptionalism. Well, what is exceptional is your book. Seriously. It has sent my mind spinning in so many different ways, and I will follow up the reading recommendations that you make, and I hope our listeners will as well. Thank you so much for being a guest closing Series 2 of the History RETECH podcast. Keep up your great work, and thanks for everything that you've done to help the history community there in Bristol, and now you've gone global with this work as well.
Well, thank you so much. That's been brilliant. And I've enjoyed it. Good conversation.
Thanks very much. Thanks, everyone. And we'd love your feedback. Please do keep in touch. Have a happy, safe summer holidays wherever you are. And we will see you in the autumn.